John 4:17. Respondit mulier et dixit non habeo virum. Dicit ei Iesus, benedixisti, quia non habeo virum. The woman answered and said, I do not have a husband. Jesus says to her, you have spoken well, that I do not have a husband. This is an interesting entry in our continuing dialogue between Jesus and the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well. There's a little bit of an odd expression here, which the 16th century humanist Erasmus criticized, and we're going to get to that in a moment. Let's just deal with any other elements in the sentence that we want to look at here. For the most part, these words of answering and speaking and replying are all pretty standard fare for us at this point. One thing we didn't really talk about before, though, is the use of this word vir, generally meaning in Latin man, but here husband. Hopefully this didn't confuse you, but if it did, it's a good sign that we need to remember that nouns especially can take on a lot of different meanings in Latin depending on the context. Vir, in its most basic meaning, means man, but not only man as opposed to woman, man as embodying characteristically male attributes, to such an extent that in some contexts, vir, for instance in epic poetry sometimes, can actually mean something like hero. Not just the male of the species, but a man's man, so to speak, at least according to the cultural expectations of the Romans. It can also, though, mean my man or her man, which is to say husband. A man who belongs, so to speak, to a particular person because of the bond of matrimony. And contextually, we can see that that's what's going on here. She doesn't just mean, I don't have a man. She means, I don't have sort of a lawfully wedded husband. And that distinction is going to become important in subsequent verses, as we'll see. So that's just a little note. In general, for those of you who've learned Greek as well, the pattern when you're learning both Latin and Greek with vocabulary is that Greek vocabulary can be extremely precise. It's like a scalpel. And although there are, of course, ambiguities in the use of Greek vocabulary, as in any language, that's just the nature of human communication, the way that the Greeks spoke and wrote, at least most of them, employed the full resources most of the time of that precision. That's one of the reasons Greek is very well suited as the early language of Christian theology. It's useful for making very fine distinctions. And Latin can be too, but the trend in the Latin language is actually more the opposite, which is fewer words standing for a greater number of concepts, meanings, semantic fields, etc. So there's a little bit more ambiguity when it comes to interpreting Latin vocabulary. And I'm speaking here just in very simplistic general terms, okay? Don't hold me to scholarly precision on this. But as a language learner, this is something you'll notice if you're working through Latin and you already have some knowledge of Greek. And this is a good example of how many different things some Latin nouns can mean. And of course, to some extent, we find that in Greek and in every other language as well. But it's particularly pronounced in Latin as compared to Greek, which you'll discover if you're learning them in tandem. Okay, let's look at this last bit now. Quia non habeo virum. So when Jesus says, by the way, benedixisti, he's not praising the woman's elocution. He's not saying, wow, you're really an accomplished speaker. He's saying, you've spoken rightly. In other words, you've told the truth. And then what he says is, you've told the truth in saying, we have to insert something like that idea in English here. You've told the truth in saying that I don't have a husband. Now, obviously, Jesus is attributing these words to the woman. He's not speaking in his own person saying, I, Jesus, do not have a husband, which would be absurd on many different levels. But because we've got quia, we expect something different. We expect him to say, rather, in keeping with the normal Latin convention, you've spoken truly in saying that you don't have a husband. And the reason for this confusion here is quia is standing in for Greek hoti, this conjunction. And our translator here is hewing so closely to a word-for-word translation of the Greek syntax that it's rendered sort of a silly Latin clause by accident. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, The Dutch humanist Erasmus of Rotterdam in the 16th century, in his annotations on his new Greek text of the New Testament and his new and improved Latin translation, his kind of correction of the Vulgate, had this to say, and I've just written it below so that you can see it. Quaeso quid ex hisce verbis percipi potest, nisi mulierem dixisse quod Christus non habuerit virum. What he's saying here is, I ask you. He's sort of pleading with his reader's common sense here. He's saying, I ask you, what can be understood from these words, namely this clause here that we're looking at, quia non habeo virum. What can be understood from these words besides or except that, and here he shifts into indirect discourse, the accusative infinitive construction, that the woman said that Christ did not have a husband. So in other words, what Erasmus is saying here is, this is bad Latin. It's giving everybody the wrong impression about who is communicating what. And sure, we know this from context because we know the scriptures, but this is not good. So he offers two alternatives, which he says would be better. Benedixisti te virum non habere. You said rightly that, and then he uses the accusative infinitive construction here. You rightly said that you don't have a husband. Or he says the translator could have done this, benedixisti, and then just dropped right into the direct quotation of the woman, non habeo virum. But it's the insertion of quia in the Vulgate here, which Erasmus is saying is causing so many problems.